Hello my friends and welcome back to Player Display. So I am actually fresh out of the movie theater after just watching Kingdom of the Planet of the Apes, and I thought it would be perfect timing to do a relatively quick PodGuy podcast on ranking all of the Apes movies. Now, this is a franchise which, if you know my action figure reviews, is very near and dear to my heart, especially the original 5. The new ones, not quite as much. We'll get into that as we do, but it's just a really interesting franchise I wanted to talk about because we've seen the franchise iterated on 2 occasions. Well, technically 3 if you count the Burton one, but it's just really interesting because each of these universes for the Apes franchises, they each have a very unique mission. They each come out of a very different time period for movies that really do inform how they come out. So there are some that are very introspective, they're very thoughtful, they're very deep probing. Then there are other ones which are a lot more action-oriented. They're a little bit more Hollywood. You could probably tell that I've got a little bit of a duality between the 2 mega franchises within Planet of the Apes here. But, yeah, of course, there were 5 movies in the original franchise. Then we had 1 single entry from Tim Burton. And then we have 3, which is now 4, being, I guess, the modern reboot franchise. So it's very late at night, and honestly, I'm probably not even prepared to do this, but I just wanted to go over these movies and rank them just based on how I prefer them. Now, I have not rewatched every single one of them in preparation for this video. I remember them well enough, and I've seen all of them except for one of them multiple times, so I remember them a pretty good amount enough that I think I'm able to do this video. So before we begin, let me just be sure my audio is recording. Yes, it is. Very good. So anyhow, let's start with 1968's Planet of the Apes, the movie that started it all. Let's get this right out of the way. It's S tier. It is my favorite movie in the entire franchise, bar none. No other movie here is going to top it or equal it. I think it is as close to cinematic perfection as you can get. That's saying a lot, being a person who loves so many genres, so many movies, so many eras within film, but this might be in my top 10 movies of all time. To provide, I guess, a little bit of context of my experience with this movie, there's going to be more context here than with the rest of them because, again, this started my experience. I was shown this movie, I believe, in middle school. I think I saw this one in anticipation for Rise of the Planet of the Apes. So I was first introduced to the original 1968 film. And unfortunately, my one error in this viewing experience is that I had the ending spoiled to me by my own mother, so I feel really terrible about that, but that doesn't at all take away from how goddamn brilliant this film is. I mean, it's really interesting. You have this man who's on this space journey, who's just looking for other mysteries of life in the universe, and then he lands on this, well, Planet of the Apes. And I'm trying to view this from the perspective of someone who is seeing this in 1968, because of course so much of this is just part of pop culture lexicon now that now it's just matter of fact. But I imagine if you're one of those people who's seeing this film for the very first time, then it's simply just a wacky upside down world where apes are the dominant species and humans are the cattle. And then, of course, you've got Taylor, who becomes part of that cattle, and then he's just watching this new ape culture, studying it, and we're watching it with him, learning about its little intricacies, what they believe in, and it's a very fascinating movie to listen to. I mean, there's a reason why a lot of people just call this one giant Twilight Zone episode. Not just because it's very thoughtful, it ends with a really crazy plot twist. It's made by the same folks who did Twilight Zone. So you know this movie's in good hands. And there's so many great characters in it. I mean, you've got Taylor, of course. Then you've got Zira and Cornelius, the scientists, who are very curious about this anomaly within their culture, being that humans are so dumbed down. Everyone says that, there's nothing more foolish than a human. There's no good human but a dead human. I know I'm quoting the sequel, but that's pretty much what they believe here, at least a majority of the ape populace. They're hunted for sport. I don't think they're hunted for food or anything, but anyways, going back to Zira and Cornelius, they're the exceptions in that they find this one human who's acting very intelligently compared to the rest of them. He is able to draw in the sand. I mean, they don't see that part, but, he attempts that. He tries imitating speech, and eventually he does speak, because his throat heals up, that arguably a little faster than it should, but that's aside from the point. But, yeah, another great character, you get Dr. Zaius, who I argue is perhaps one of the most underrated, I'm hesitant to say villain, but one of the most underrated antagonists of all time. You have this character who knows the full history of this Planet of the Apes. We don't know it's Earth yet. We just think it's like some crazy multiversal discrepancy of sorts. But he knows the full history of Earth. Let's just say it. We know it's our planet. And he knows that eventually, not necessarily did ape usurp man, but rather man destroyed themselves. And that was because of their intelligence. And Zaius sees the importance in suppressing this information from the greater ape culture, so that way apes are not questioning themselves and where they come from, and they're not taking in the possibility that perhaps humans could also exist on a similar pedestal. And he doesn't want humans to get any higher than where they already are, because he knows about their self-destructive nature. So that's why he doesn't want the apes to know Taylor can speak. He doesn't want him to reproduce, thus creating more talkative humans. He knows that humans are a bad thing, because they've proven so. So, anyways, what I'm trying to say here is this is a movie full of so many interesting character archetypes. Like, again, you've got Zaius, who's, again, I refuse to call him a villain, because he's simply just trying to protect his people from their own history. Then you got the scientists, being Cornelius and Zira, and then you also have this really interesting hierarchy. It's not even a hierarchy. That would suggest that some are above or below others, but not necessarily. Like, each group serves their roles. Like, you've got the chimps, who are the scientists, then you've got the orangutans, who are the politicians, and then you have the gorillas, who are the brutes, the foot soldiers, who are arguably the most iconic of the three. And it's just really interesting how they set up this world. You learn about its culture, you learn about what they know and what they don't know, and slowly you start to realize not necessarily that this is our planet, but this was once a planet in which human intelligence did exist. So when you get to that very ending, and then you see Taylor at the feet of the fallen Statue of Liberty, then that's when everything comes full circle. That's when you learn this is Earth, our Earth, just in the future, and humanity had destroyed themselves because of whatever conflicts, and then apes were just all that was left. And that's really fascinating. And this movie's even more interesting when you consider the historical subtext of when this movie was coming out. It was right, I think, immediately before the Vietnam conflict when this movie was being produced. Of course, it was adapted from a French novel, I believe. But, like, they were conceiving this movie before this conflict began. But there was still this fear of missiles, of bombings, duck and cover and all that, right? And then you get this movie where at the end it postulates, what if humanity did, in fact, doom itself? Or damned itself, as Taylor said. And That's why this movie is the strongest of all of them. I feel like this is the only one that's not necessarily trying to create a narrative after the fact. It's not trying to be a franchise. It's trying to be a single story. Like, that's why Twilight Zone works so well. They're episodic. You take one, you see the ending, usually with a plot twist, and you let it sit with you with a question and you think about it. I don't think any of these other movies let you sit and think like this movie does. But this one really makes you consider the flaw of man. How is it we could allow ourselves to fall so low to the point that there is another species that is more worthy of the apex predator mantle, which is, in this case, the evolved apes. So it's just a movie loaded with fascinating concepts, and I feel like I'm doing it an injustice and not watching it right before doing this video. But again, I literally just watched Kingdom. That's why I wanted to do this video, while those thoughts are so fresh in my mind, so we could talk about that at the very end of this podcast. But yeah, Planet of the Apes, it's a golden movie. I think it's absolutely fantastic. Every time I watch it, there's something else that I notice in it. There's so much to peel apart and to think about, to consider. It's easily the most important movie of all of these. I think you could potentially drop every single other movie in this franchise, just have Planet of the Apes 68 and be done. And that's all you really need. The rest of it's kind of supplementary, trying to do their own things. So, speaking of that, why don't we go ahead and talk about the other movies? Not going to have as much to say about the rest of these, just because they're not quite as introspective as Ape 68, if I may call it that, but they still have elements that are worth discussing. So that brings us to Beneath the Planet of the Apes. Now, this is a weird one, because it is historically marred with production issues. Charlton Heston didn't really want to come back. They're working with, I think, a tighter budget. They had a new lead. The story itself is totally bonkers, but I still kind of enjoy it. So effectively, Taylor falls into this apparition, and then he falls into the custody of this underground society of mutants who worship a bomb. And that's a wild idea that probably wouldn't pass now, which is why I guess remakes have barely even grazed that concept at all. But again, when you think about the context for the time, it's something that does kind of work. When you think about people who are so committed to a bomb and what it can do, and basically the resolve of mass extinction and what it means, then it really just makes you consider, like, the fallacy within human ethics. Like, if we're willing to just let everything be laid to waste, what does that say about us, about our culture? And when you're thinking about the nations and the issues of the time during, I believe it was, I'm not sure if this was like late 60s movies or it was right when the 70s was happening. I don't know the years for the rest of them. But when you're thinking about that time, then you're thinking about the alienation of other cultures. You don't know what other nations and cultures are thinking about these explosives, these super weapons. Like, how much is the idea of obliterating another culture important to them? Like, if it becomes, like, to the point that it's spiritual necessity that they obliterate someone else, what does that say about humanity and how good or bad we are? If we're capable of tolerating the idea of genocide, what does that mean for us? We could even, like, take that context into, of course, World War II, which is the genocide, of course. If we can sink that low, what does that mean for us? Like, that's why I find the Alpha Omega cult, I suppose you could call it, so interesting. As for the rest of the movie, it's kind of a retread, I will admit, of the first movie, because you have a guy who, I wouldn't say he's a spitting image of Taylor, but everyone says he is. I don't even remember his name. That's how unmemorable he was. But he discovers Zero and Cornelius. they're like, oh, wow, another human who can speak. And then he goes through the whole gambit of escaping Zeus, and now you also have General Ursus, who I think is a really cool character. He doesn't do that much, but I think he's really cool. He has an awesome hat, so just let me have that. But anyways, it all comes to this, this head in the plot where you have all these sides converging. You get the apes marching down into that mutant human society that worships the bomb, and you have our two leads come together again, with Nova, who's there, by the way. That's kind of just a product of the 60s, just to have eye candy there to bring in a greater audience. Like, again, that's kind of the charm of these movies, because they show their age in that way. But anyhow, Nova aside, you have Taylor, then Taylor version 2, then you got the apes, then you got the mutants, and then you see them coming to blows, killing each other, and ultimately, Taylor, the hero of the first movie, is one responsible for detonating the bomb, for destroying both. And apparently the planet, because the bomb just happens to be that strong. So, again, it's a movie that's not as intelligent as the first one. It's pretty clear that this movie is a product of some higher-ups seeing the success of the first movie, and they're going, oh, wait, we actually struck gold here, let's make a franchise out of it. So, obviously, they tied up this whole script together very fast. Obviously, there's no book that this movie was informed by. The first movie was informed by a book. This one is just a movie for movie's sake. And I know not everyone loves it, but I happen to enjoy it. I think it's got some interesting base concepts. I don't think the mutant and bomb idea is too outlandish for me. It works for me for some reason. The direction's clunky. There are some far-fetched ideas, like with the mutants having telekinetic abilities, stuff like that and all, but I do still enjoy watching this, because it's by no means boring. It's an interesting movie, and you do think a little bit about it, because now you are presented with a literal bomb. I mean, these movies, that's the thing that I love about these initial 5 movies, is that they have political subtext, and they put it right in front of you. And they expect you to figure out what to do with that subtext, and to think about it, to mull over it, and I appreciate these movies for being so blunt. And this is one of the bluntest. You have a straight-up bomb during the bomb crisis of the late 60s, early 70s, you know what I mean? That was right before Vietnam. So, this movie, honestly, we're just focusing on how much I enjoy these films. I'll put it in B for now. I'll have to think about it. I also have to think about what an A tier would be. I'm really just not sure yet. So, anyhow, let's move on to the next movie, which is Escape from the Planet of the Apes. And I'd say this is probably, objectively, one of the stronger movies here. Although at the same time, it's a very inconsistent movie in terms of tone. Everyone who's seen it knows that this movie's solid, but it's split right down the middle in terms of what type of movie it is. When it starts, you have Cornelius, Zira, and Milo? Yeah, that scientist Milo. Land on Earth in the past when humans are the dominant species. So now you got a role reversal, kind of, but rather than the apes being treated as animals or cattle, they're treated as celebrities, because they're quite literally out of this world. Everyone wants to get to know them. They want to know where they come from, what they're like, what their culture was like, and it plays off initially as a really zany 70s comedy. It's very silly. There's a lot of laughs in there. It's goofy. And everything comes to a head in the second half when people start really thinking about, where do these apes come from? Why are they so intelligent? Did they come from a different planet? Or did they come from a different time period within our own planet? And if they did exist within our timeline, what does that mean for us? Especially if they're from our future. What do we look like in their future? And then you have this one I don't know what you'd call him, like an agent, an interrogator. I'm not really sure. I don't recall his name either. He is terrified by these questions, and he's hell-bent on murdering Zira and Cornelius and their son Milo, who's not called Caesar yet. He's still Milo. And he thinks he's successful. He kills Zira, he kills Cornelius, and one of the darkest finales I've ever seen for a film. And he thinks that he kills baby Milo, but it turns out he was bamboozled. There was an ape swap. So you just had a standard zoo ape, so very sadly, getting shot. A little baby ape gets killed in that movie. And then, of course, you have Milo saying mama at the very end. So you know that the seeds have been planted for more events to transpire, leading to Ape 68. And that is what makes this movie the most meta of all of them. I think this is the first time we've ever seen a movie franchise, let alone a story, be able to self-maintain itself, in that it doesn't have a definitive beginning and it doesn't have a definitive end. This movie suggests that there's a circle, because you have characters from the future go into the past, leave a child behind, then that child affects the future, which creates the parents, who then go in the past, then leave a child behind, who then leads to events where the parents exist, and so on forever and ever. So I just think that's a really fascinating tangent. Like, not one that they outwardly mention has happened necessarily. It's something you got to figure out on your own. But once you make that realization, then that just creates for a really interesting fictional timeline. So, I mean, I wouldn't call it a plot twist necessarily. It's more so just the basic world building. But compared to the plot twist of Ape 68, I think this one has the second biggest aha moment, if you get what I mean. It's the next movie in the franchise that does blow you away. Once you make that realization of how you have a circular, ever-repeating timeline, rather than just a linear plane. And because it's not linear, and it's repeating itself, that's when you start wondering, can it change? Can it be altered? Can humans do better? Can ape be better or worse? And it just opens a whole new door of questions. So, even though it might not be trying to be that intelligent, it ultimately leads you down a very interesting path. So, that being said, I think it's more thoughtful than Beneath. Obviously, as I said, Planet of the Apes is tops for me. It has to be S tier. So, I will give Escape an A. I feel like that's where it belongs in terms of its ability to tell you a story, and then it trusts you to put the pieces together on your own. It has faith that you'll understand the significance of Zira and Cornelius being where they are in the timeline, and the significance of their child Milo. But as we see in the next film, being Conquest, I say Conquest in bold font, because I always get Conquest confused with Battle, the two titles, for some reason. But the reason why Conquest is so interesting is because now we're no longer focused on any of the characters that we've seen before. Now we are focused on Caesar, who of course was Milo before, but now he renames himself Caesar, because this is where we get my personal favorite character within this entire franchise, being Roddy McDowell Caesar, who's very, very immature. He's very childish, in a way. He's kind of just a young kid. He is constantly asking questions. He's very impatient. I mean, he has sort of an agitation factor, like when he screams "lousy human bastards" and then he almost gives himself away. He practically does, like, then you got Martaban with him, and then he has to cover for him, and he winds up taking his own life to protect him. But yeah, you got Caesar here, and you've got a brand new type of hero here. You have this character who's not part of the original character roster that we had before. We have somebody who's brand new, and he is the byproduct of everything that has transpired in the past. However, he's just as important. In fact, maybe even more so to the general timeline. He's even more important than Taylor when you really think about it. Taylor was simply realizing things. He was the foothold for the audiences, the lens through which we see this culture developing. But Taylor himself doesn't affect the plot of the movie itself or the timeline necessarily, aside from blowing up the Earth. But that wouldn't make a difference because Cornelius and Zira already left. Caesar is the one who makes the timeline the way that it is. Because he's unique, because he's highly evolved, because he can speak. So now he exists in a dystopian future, which looks a lot like Metropolis in a lot of ways now I think about it. We discussed Metropolis a little bit in the past with that model kit and everything. But now we have Caesar in a world where apes are the new pets, because there was a plague which wiped out cats and dogs. Again, that's where it leads a little bit into the wacky side, but I kind of love that too. It speaks to the retro-iness of these films, the basic groundwork. That's how a lot of these movies play out. Sometimes the basic groundwork is really strange. You got mutants who worship a bomb. You have a planet where apes are superior. You have a plague that wipes out cats and dogs, so apes are the new pets. They always start with a really strange, fantastical foundation, but then they, no joke intended, evolve into something a lot more complex than that. So you have Caesar, and similarly to Taylor, he's kind of batched in with his own kind. Now he's a peasant ape, he no longer has Martoban protecting him, so he's kind of on his own, and he's seeing the cruelty of man. And then he's able to orchestrate a rebellion in which the apes are able to come together, and as far as we know, at the very least, take over this city. And I'm not sure what city this is specifically, like if it's in LA, if it's in New York. It's in the future, so any, city or town could have built up by then, whatever. And I guess there's the plot hole of how do suddenly all apes look like Caesar at this point? And I guess my answer to that is maybe this plague that killed cats and dogs, it caused not only apes to rapidly evolve, but because there was no cats or dogs, perhaps humans bioengineered apes to be better servants to them, or something like that. I don't know. That's just the way I'm thinking. So, anyways, you got Caesar, and I totally left this point out. I apologize. The reason why he's named Caesar, again, this plays into his arrogance a little bit. He sees himself as a savior. He sees himself as a king, someone who's destined to do something. And you have good reason, he has good reason to assume that, because he knows who his parents were to a degree. He knows that he's special, and he's in a perfect place to do something for his own kind. So it all comes to a head at the very end, where he and the apes take down the humans and this agency that's meant to suppress them. And then you have another man. And then, again, this is where it gets very blunt in its themes. You have... what was his name? I don't remember his name. But there's a black man who he's fighting alongside with. Not even fighting alongside with. It's just they're friends. He doesn't want to hurt him or anything like that. So he allows him to continue on, and he doesn't get hurt. And by the time that Caesar's up there, ready to give his whole monologue, his friend's asking him, by what right do you have to conquer and dominate man? And Caesar says, it's what they did to us. Why not? It's only fair. And again, that's a very immature view. And that's what makes him such a unique character. He's not by any means a perfect leader. He's not perfectly dutiful. He has a sense of what's right, but he isn't so concerned with the consequences of doing what's right. He doesn't care about what happens to mankind. In fact, he feels as though mankind should be purged. But even then, it's not without good reason. He's seen the cruelty, he's seen the persecution, he's seen the apes become servants, become lapdogs, effectively. So, and that's another interesting thing about this movie. There's two alternate endings. There's one ending in which he beats down the humans and kills them after his monologue. And then there's the theatrical ending, which I actually prefer, where he says, if we're going to dominate man, then we should do so with compassion and understanding. That's what gives this character something called an arc. We don't see that a whole ton these days. But he says, even though this is a birth of the Planet of the Apes, it's not to say that our responsibility is to destroy man. Man will choose their own fate, effectively. But as for apes, this is their day. So, anyhow, thematically, this film, again, it's ripe with archetypes, with ideas. It's just a very good film, thematically. But you also get some really cool action. You get the really awesome trademark makeup work, which I haven't even discussed yet. I love the makeup work of these initial 5 films so much. And, again, it's the most action-oriented of the movies we've seen thus far. It's cool to watch, but it's also very interesting to listen to. It's a good balance of both, and I appreciate it for that. So, I will give Conquest... I'd say I perhaps enjoy it almost on equal footing with Escape. So, would I put it above? I mean, that's the thing. I love this Caesar, but we only get him for 2 movies. So, that makes things a little complicated. But, So do I prefer the plot or the idea of Escape of the Planet of the Apes? Or do I prefer Caesar in him of himself as a character and seeing how he develops? I'd say Conquest is stronger when you have Battle as a supplement, but Escape does a better job being its own isolated story, I suppose. Conquest is more so the first part of a 2-part story, which is Caesar's arc. That's the best way I could put it. So I'll put Conquest beneath Escape. That makes the most sense to me. So now we go on to Battle. Again, this is a movie that not everyone loves, but I actually find this one really interesting because it plays, again, into that idea that was posited in Escape, where you have a circular, repeating timeline rather than a linear one. That being said, this movie returns quite literally to grassroots. Now you're seeing the apes on horseback again, you're seeing the vast, open, sprawling fields, the trees, and humans serving apes. But this time, they're more sophisticated. And I actually do enjoy this movie. I mean, it is working with a smaller budget, and it does show, but I do still enjoy the overall plot. It's very simple. It's not very complex at all. But effectively, you have Caesar trying to rediscover his past. He learns more about his parents, being Cornelius and Zero, of course. And you also have a callback to Beneath, where you have the mutants, effectively. Well, they're not mutants yet, but they're a little bit destroyed by radiation. But again, it's our fault that they're like that, because they're warring against each other. So that might explain why they were mutants in Beneath, because of the radiation fear that there was in the 60s and 70s. So anyways, that's a little tangent for you there. But I guess it's basically 2 different plots occurring at once. You have Caesar trying to discover his past, while there's also the mystery of the murder of his son, Cornelius, who's named after his father, of course. And then you also have the mutants marching in to ransack their whole tribe, effectively. So the mutants are defeated and chased away. And then you also learn that Kid Cornelius is the best way I can call him. It sounds like a rapper's name or something. But Kid Cornelius was killed by another ape, being Aldo. And this is, I feel like, very overlooked. You have Caesar, who's effectively the leader of everything. He creates the rules, everyone follows the rules, no questions asked, no ifs, ands, or buts. You follow the rules. One of these rules is ape does not kill ape. However, an ape kills an ape. In this case, Aldo kills Kid Cornelius because Kid Cornelius realizes the plot of the gorillas taking over Caesar's throne. So he wants to kill him to be sure he doesn't play whistleblower. So when Caesar realizes that Aldo killed his son, he's not only is a rule broken, but Caesar has to reflect on the legitimacy of these rules that are put in place. And we're almost seeing this parallel between apes and man, where if we go against our own ethics, what does that say about us? Humans go against our own ethics by destroying each other. Apes in this universe do exactly the same thing. An ape can kill another ape. What does that say about apes? That suggests they're just as flawed as we are. But that's what creates a very beautiful and poetic ending to this saga that we've had, this 5-movie saga. Learning that both human and man are flawed. And then it leaves us with this question of, can we coexist, not with one on top of the other, but as equals, as similarly intelligent species working together in harmony? It leaves you with that question. Can that circular timeline be changed for the better? Can there be an alteration in which there is a better future? Or is there nothing we can do? Is everything locked in place? Is it out of our hands? Has everything that Caesar's done been for naught? And that's a possibility. So I really do appreciate this movie. I know a lot of people rag on it because it says battle for the planet of the apes, and it's a pretty small scale skirmish. It's not a battle by any means, but it's really the themes that are carried, especially towards the conclusion, that wrap up all 5 movies together in a very interesting way. It says, like, despite everything that you've seen, all these 2 species contradictions within their own cultures, are they able to build a better fate for themselves? Can they work together in doing so? And that's a great question. Like, we don't know if Caesar can do that. We don't know if the mutants can do that. No one really wins at the end of this quote-unquote battle. Everyone's kind of just left wondering what's going to happen next. And the same can be said about the audience. So, that being said, I like that this saga is inconclusive. And thematically, it makes sense. Again, it's a circular timeline. So, I don't dislike this movie. I actually do quite appreciate it. So, I'll give it a B tier. But I think I'll put it above Beneath. Because we get Caesar, and the story is stronger than Beneath. I mean, you don't get the protagonist swapping out, throughout the film or anything like that, so it's more consistent. Focuses on Cornelius the kid, of course, but Caesar more specifically. It's more character focused. They also got Aldo, who's a really great archetype as well, of just the brutish nature or side of the ape culture. I just think this is also a movie that could be taken apart a little bit. And yeah, that's it for these 5 movies. Again, I'm very tired, so I did my best rattling off why I love these so much, but I hope it was concise enough. But it really comes down to the fact that I love that you have a timeline that contributes to itself, and it's not just a straight line. And because of that, it opens the door to so many more questions. And what are the answers to those questions? Well, it's up to you. You gotta figure that out yourself. So, anyhow, that takes us into Tim Burton's Planet of the Apes. Now, this is the one movie that I have not seen in full of all these ones here. But I think I know that it's an F tier. I know enough about this movie to judge it objectively enough, or subjectively rather, because again, this is a subjective list. This is just my feelings on everything. But yeah, this movie, it's had no importance within pop culture whatsoever. I don't think there was anything thoughtful about it. I mean, the one time that it tries to do that is when it tries replicating the ending of Ape 68, where instead you have the Lincoln Memorial, and then he has an ape head, and then the cop cars flood in, and then all the apes pop out, and it's just a broken timeline, right? So, this movie's so unimportant. There's no reason for me to see it. There's no reason for me to really study through it or anything. There's just not much to say on this. It's just a weird anomaly within all these movies. I mean, from what I know, the makeup work is really good, and it is. I have seen that in action at the very least. Acting's wishy-washy. The plot, obviously, when you think about the conclusion, it couldn't have meant much or enough for me to want to watch it. And basically, from the little I know about it, it's enough for me to know it's not that great. So I'll give it an F, or if that bothers you, we could just say, oh, it's a question mark tier, because I haven't seen it before, but I have a pretty good hunch it's not that great of a film. So anyhow, moving on to the reboot series, which I think I began in 2012, 14, I don't quite remember. There's a pretty big span of time between each of these movies, which is a good thing. That means they could put the work into it to make them into very beautiful films. But as far as story is concerned, that's where I started having some issues. I don't have as much to say about these movies, because again, if I'm going to watch Apes movies, it's going to be the original 68 and onwards. I'm not as personally attached to these new ones as much. However, I do think Rise of the Planet of the Apes is a pretty damn good movie. Obviously, it's riffing off of Conquest, where you have Caesar rallying up the apes together against the humans and everything. However, these movies, they're too Hollywood for me. They rely a little too heavily on action, on CGI. I guess that's a tangent that we'll go off of. Why is it that I prefer the originals more than the new ones? More specifically, why is it that they're not making the new ones like the old ones? I think it's because the old ones were so heavily informed by the historical subtext of the time. But the ones that we have now, they're engineered with the purpose of being a mega franchise. They're not trying to be as thoughtful, and when they are, they're usually just recycling the same themes that we've seen already, so they're not fascinating. That's the thing about them. They don't make you go into your own head and try to evaluate humanity or apes as nearly to the same caliber as the original ones. And I think it's on part of the writing. I don't think that there's enough of that interesting dialogue. And when there is dialogue, it's usually because, we need to get from point A to point B in the plot. Not necessarily just discussing, how is the culture this way or anything like that. Like, we're not sitting within a culture that already exists, like in Ape 68. Instead, we just have Earth, and then we have apes, and then we have Caesar here, who is the byproduct of a cure for Alzheimer's, which of course becomes the plague that is the doom of humankind. And that's another flaw of these movies. Humankind doesn't destroy itself because humankind is dangerous. Humankind falls because of one scientist who makes a fluke. It's not an intelligent way to go down. It's not as thoughtful. Like, creating a virus on accident and wiping everyone else, it's not as thought-provoking as people just straight up going to war against each other. This canon suggests that human beings are altruistic and just might accidentally wipe out humanity as a result of wanting to do something good. But it's not suggesting that human beings can also be bad quite as much. So when you see the apes hammering down on the human beings, on the cops and stuff like that, it's not because the cops have, like, this disdain towards apes or this prejudice towards apes. Because in the original movies, and Conquest specifically, of course, these cops and everyone, they're using apes as pets because they know about the potential future that they could cause because of Caesar's existence, because Cornelius and Zero were there. But here, there's not really a reason for humans to be against the apes, aside from simply protecting themselves, and that's it. It doesn't have that underlying subtext that made the original one so interesting. So, that being said, as for Rise of the Planet of the Apes and its own merits, it's a good action movie. You got Caesar, you've got DeFranco, of course, being his father figure and all that. Then Caesar's put in an encampment, and there are a few cruel humans, but it's not like metaphorical humans where all humans are bad, like it kind of was in the original films. Here it's like one or two are bad, therefore all of them must be bad, right? But yeah, Caesar's really only set off by how he's treated by a few people, not a lot of them, really. So I don't know, it doesn't seem like as much of a calculated choice to revolt as opposed to the Roddy McDowall Caesar that we get, where he's in this really heavily suppressive dystopia. Here, it's not quite as believable. I mean, I guess you can also argue you do get another juvenile Caesar who is a little bit in over his head about the apes being able to fight back. And here, it's simply because there's a virus floating around. In the original ones, it's because the apes are able to pull themselves together and use human weaponry against the humans themselves, I suppose. I don't know where I'm going here. But, yeah, just Rise of the Planet of the Apes, it's a fun movie. That bridge scene is awesome. But that's kind of all I have to say about it, really. It's not as thematic. The reason why the humans and the apes are fighting each other isn't as well-founded. Like, you have other apes flood in from the zoos to contribute towards the revolting effort, but you're like, why are they fighting back? They weren't ingesting that cure to Alzheimer's like all the other ones were. So, yeah, that's the thing. These movies are just loaded with little tiny contrivances and plot holes that just don't make sense. And you could probably say the same for the original movies, but I say they get away with it because they're supposed to be fantastical. They're supposed to be heavily metaphorical. Therefore, it's okay if you give them the benefit of the doubt. Because they're trying to be allegorical. They're trying to be thematic. They're not trying to be grounded and literal like these next 4 movies that we're going to be discussing. So, and I guess the last thing I'll say is Andy Serkis. He's not my preferred Caesar, but he is a damn good actor, so that's really cool. However, I do prefer makeup over motion capture any day. So, anyhow, where would I put this movie? Really, I would prefer to see any of the original movies over the new ones. But still, I'll give it a B tier, but I'm going to put it beneath. It's the best way I could put it. Because again, I'd rather see the original 5 in sequence than go out of my way to watch the remakes. So, speaking of that, this movie baffles me in a number of ways. You have Dawn of the Planet of the Apes. A lot of people have said that this is the best Apes movie of them all. And I really just don't get it. Please explain it to me if that's how you feel. I don't understand that. It's an okay movie. Like, it does a good job with Koba. I think Koba is a very good character. And then his conflict with Caesar, and how there's this polarity between them. Then you got the human society and all of that. And then you have the scarred character kill the heroic character, then take over the kingdom, and then the hero comes back in some form or another, defeats a scarred villain, and then he reinstates the values of that society. But you know what I just did? I just described the plot of Lion King and Black Panther. That's my issue with this movie. It's too derivative of stories that we've already seen. It wasn't original enough for me to put it any higher. Like, I think, again, joke not intended, this movie is the natural evolution for the franchise. It's a movie that makes sense thematically. Like, you have one ape who is treated very well by humankind overall. Then you have one ape, being Koba, who was given the short end of the stick. He was a science rabbit. They were testing on him, perhaps since birth, and he's never seen a silver lining in humanity ever before. So it makes sense that there's this paradigm between Caesar and Koba. However, I can't love this movie because even though the story makes sense for this timeline, it's not a story that I'm interested in seeing again, because I've seen it elsewhere. I've seen it in Lion King, where it was good. I've seen it in Black Panther, which I also couldn't enjoy as much, because again, it's just Lion King again. And then I'm seeing it a third time here in Dawn of the Planet of the Apes, and I'm like, I wish they could have done something a little bit more complex and more interesting. And I didn't really care about any of the humans at all. I mean, the humans are definitely a weak point in these upcoming movies, for sure. But yeah, like, Koba had some great moments. I think Koba was the highlight of this whole film. But the final confrontation, it was cool, it was pretty, cinematic and all. And it made poetic sense, but we knew it was coming to that. We knew Caesar was going to win. The thing is, they took a generic story, and even though it is the natural progression of this timeline, they didn't do anything to make it different. And I think that's what bothers me about this movie. So I think I'm pretty easily going to give it a C tier. It's an enjoyable movie, but I'm not interested in it. I'm not invested in it much. I think I prefer to watch Rise because it's parallel to Conquest, but not totally derivative of it. I feel like Dawn is too on the nose, so I do prefer Rise more than Dawn. That's just how I am. So, going on to War, this one I feel like it's the most forgettable. I always try remembering what happened in this movie and what the plot is, and it always escapes me. No pun intended with the Escape of the Planet of the Apes movie, but anyhow. Yeah, what was the plot of this movie? Yeah, Caesar's family is executed by this militia, which is Alpha Omega, which is, again, an homage to Beneath the Planet of the Apes. And then Caesar, very uncharacteristically, goes out for revenge to defeat this group, but instead becomes a prisoner, and all of his people are imprisoned as a result of that. And then you just have a prison breakout story. But I don't get anything more out of this movie. Like, really, I remember being in the theater and watching the story play out, and I'm like, yeah, it's a new story, but there's nothing to peel apart. There's no juicy nectar to this. Like, it's cool to watch transpire. That's the thing about these movies, these new four. They transpire. They're meant to get from point A to point Z. They're meant to just follow a story, but not tell a story. is the best way I can put it. It's not trying to be thematic. They're not trying to be introspective. They're just trying to tell a tale within this timeline. And for a franchise that has already done so much better than that, you can't do anything less than what the originals have already done. So really, I have no connection to this movie whatsoever. I'll give it a D tier. Now that brings us to Kingdom of the Planet of the Apes. Just saw this hours ago, fresh out of the theater, and I do think I preferred it more than War, perhaps more than Dawn. However, I don't think it was a strong movie. I think the parts were greater than the whole. I like that it was telling a more unique story, and I did like the fact that it was going back to archetypes. I feel like it was going more back to roots than the 3 previous movies were. For example, I think Proximus, I don't think he was used very well, but I thought he was a really great new type of character. This is a character who's fully aware of Earth's history, of apes rising above man. And he wants to improve from both through a very sadistic and pragmatic way, which is effectively conquering other ape tribes and then bringing them into his own to create the titular kingdom. And he feels very Genghis Khan in that way. Excuse me. He wants to bring in all these other cultures, all these other groups, in order to make one super mega unified ape culture. And that's why I found his downfall very interesting. Spoiler alert, of course. I mean, you should have known this by now. But I think his death was very poetic in that he's killed by the falcons, the birds, and all that. And that's interesting because he's killed by one of the aspects of a culture, an ape culture, that he refused to study because it was outside of the mythos of the original Caesar. So that I found very fascinating. But as cool as he was as a character, the story around him was non-existent. He's in charge of this kingdom. How did he get there? What's his personal Caesar story? Of all the apes in this kingdom, why is he the most impressive? What did he do to gain everyone else's respect? Did he do it through fear? Did he do it through compassion? Was he able to defeat a whole bunch of other human tribes to get to this point? So, without an origin, it's hard to accept him as being this leader character. So, even though he was my favorite element of this movie, I can't say he's one of the great apes characters, simply on the fact that he's just there to be there. And he sets a really interesting archetype in place, but they don't do anything with that. He doesn't learn from it. He just dies. And I feel like that's such a waste, especially considering that this is effectively going to be a new trilogy. It looks like that's where they're going with. They're going to do a new trilogy, this being the first of that trilogy, of post-Caesar apes, effectively. Why not keep Proximus around as a prevailing threat, and then we learn more about him throughout the film franchise, rather than just the one? Or, better yet, just take this one movie and expand it into an anthology series or something like that, where you get little mini stories of different tribes of apes around the world. I think that's another flaw with, not just for the reboot series, I'd say another critique for the main franchise as well. We have Caesar, whether it be Roddy McDowell or, where did his name go in my head? Oh crap, he's so good, I love him so much. Andy Serkis, there we are. No matter which Caesar you have, they cause an ape uprising, but just within this one city or village that they're at. But there's never talk about the other Caesars of the world. Was there an ape in China who caused an ape uprising? Was there an ape in the United Kingdom? Like, what's the story going on for all these other nations, all these other continents and masses of land? So that's why Proximus kind of creates a plot hole. Like, okay, there's other great Caesars out there, but where are they coming from? What are their stories? And without these stories, how are we able to care about them? The reason why we care about Circus's Caesar is because we saw him from birth. And we saw his relationship to good humans, to bad humans, to good apes, to bad apes, right? But we just throw Proximus in there. He's an even weaker villain than Koba, because at least with Koba you get an origin story. But for Proximus, you're kind of just expected to accept the fact that he is this major, no-nonsense antagonist. But you don't know how he got there. So how can we be invested in this character? Whether it be that he's just a bad-to-the-bone villain through and through, or is he someone that we can sympathize with? And I found it difficult to do either, because we're not sure where he's coming from. As for other elements of the movie, we had Noah, who was fine. He served as an okay new protagonist. I wouldn't say I was blown away by him. He was interesting enough to follow. Like, I love the idea that he was in a new tribe of apes that we've never seen before that's separate from Caesar, where, you know, it's kind of a rite of passage that you find bird eggs and then you raise them. Like, that's really interesting. But then the whole place gets burned down like 15 minutes in, and you haven't learned enough about them to care. Like, that's the thing about this movie. There's a lot of good micro concepts in there, but there's never enough time to just sit with them, let them marinate. Like, we get this new, we get Noah's tribe, but then they're destroyed 15 minutes into the movie. We meet Proximus in the kingdom halfway into the movie, and then Proximus dies. So it, like, introduces a new concept that's enticing, it's got a good foundation, and then it swiftly kills it off and leaves you with so many questions, like, how did this culture start? Where did all the apes after Proximus's downfall within the kingdom go? Where did they all wind up? So there's just a lot of questions in this movie. I think it's a better story than, obviously, the Burton one, and it's better than War and Dawn, because it's trying to do something unique while being a little bit more introspective. It's trying to play with ideas of legacy, misinterpretation, the molestation of very precious stories and legends, and the twisting of words, like apes together strong. What does that mean? Like, apes together strong against human oppression, or apes together strong in destroying humans? So that's a very interesting idea, but the characters who are interpreting these words, they don't last long enough. Like, you get that orangutan character, he dies very, very early. He was just an exposition machine. Like, I loved him, again, like, similar to Proximus, I loved him as a character, but in terms of how he's able to contribute to the story, he's just not around long enough for us to sincerely care. And I guess I'll end with this. Like, my issue with Kingdom of the Planet of the Apes and the three movies that came before is they all have great ideas and characters and archetypes, but they're seen as merely stepping stones. You're never given a chance to just really sit with them and think about them as much. Like, Caesar and Koba are exceptions. They're the best characters of the whole 4 movies that we've seen thus far. But as are the rest of them, they're like afterthoughts. Like, we really want this movie to end with this conclusion. How do we get there? They're so focused on the ending. But when you have a movie like Ape 68, it's not all about the ending. It's also about learning about the culture. It's about learning about the issues with that culture. And how that culture came to be, what they value, and what's it hiding. You know, it's about the mystery. But there's no real mystery or anything to tackle in these movies. They're simply plotting to plot. It's just movement, but there's nothing essential within them. Like, that's my issue with them. But at the same time, I understand these movies. Alright, before I continue, let me drop Kingdom of Planet of the Apes above Dawn. That works, yeah. But anyhow, as I was saying, and this is pretty much wrapping up this podcast here, I understand these movies. I understand why people like them. It's because they are more attuned to a modern audience. We're no longer living in a pre- or post-Vietnam world, really. So we're not within that mindset of being terrified of bombs as much. It's still kind of there, but that fear of humanity being able to destroy itself was a lot more prevalent during the 60s and 70s, and that's what made the original movies so strong. But as for these new ones here, they don't really have a historical context that informs them in a deep and meaningful way. They're just action movies. And they got some thought in them, but it's only because that thought was adopted from the basic elementary themes of the original movies that came before. Like, Caesar's being oppressed, therefore Caesar starts a revolution. Cool, but we saw that already. Human beings are their own means of self-destruction. Cool, but we've seen that before. You know what I mean? So, they're good as action movies, are beautiful to watch, but every strong thematic note within them is only strong because we've seen them before. And it's kind of unfortunate because there's so many great elements to them, but they just don't come together to create something wholly unique. Even though it was very abundantly clear in some of the original movies, being Battle and Beneath especially, that they had a low budget, they weren't too sure what a movie franchise was supposed to look like or anything yet. Despite those factors, at least they were trying to be thoughtful and provoking, and they were using archetypes to give you new ideas. And they encouraged you to peel the movies apart, rather than just being popcorn fun. And that's why this list is the way that it is. I wouldn't say that the new movies are outright bad. They're entertaining, but they're simply not for me, because they're missing the really deep, integral elements that made the original ones so damn good. So really, it does come down to a matter of taste. I think they're both solid franchises. It just depends on what you prefer. Do you prefer something that's more modern, more shiny, just gets to the action and the very basic character tropes and all that? Then, yeah, the Andy Serkis movies will do fine. But if you want something that's a little bit more of its time, that shows its age in a good way, then you'll probably opt for the original ones a little bit more, which is what I prefer. But, yeah, and if you're a weirdo, you prefer the Tim Burton one. Which, if it's free, then I'll watch it. But, yeah, I don't plan on touching it anytime soon. I don't see any reason to, but, yeah. But, all that being said, I love the Apes movies overall, because they create discussions, not just in terms of what themes the movies are trying to bring out on their own, but also taking these two franchises, being the original one and the reboot one, and trying to see how each of them work, what are each of their flaws, what are each of their strengths, because I personally feel like the original ones are so much stronger, but it's only because it's more to my taste, to my liking. But the new ones, I get why people like those. Because they're more modern, obviously. They're more CGI, They're more digestible, I'd say, because there's less dialogue, and it doesn't have the very upfront metaphors. They're not as fantastical. They're more grounded in reality and science. But for me, I prefer, again, the more Twilight Zone-y feel of the original movies more. So, I don't know, it's just a very interesting dialogue. I mean, let me know what you think. Do you prefer the original movies? Do you prefer the newer ones? And on top of that, depending on what your preference is, why do you think the franchise that you don't prefer does work for other people? I think that's another big question that people should be asking. Like, people who don't prefer the original movies, why do you think they worked for their time and for people now? And for people like me who don't like the remakes, why do you think that they do work currently, and why is it as big of a franchise as it is right now? For me, I think it's just because they're easier. They're easier to watch. The stories are more straightforward, they're more direct, they're not overly thematic and melodramatic, they tell it to you straight. But for me, I prefer the complexity of the originals. And it's not to say if you prefer the new ones, you're a lesser viewer or anything like that. It's not what I'm saying at all. I'm just saying, if you prefer just more action, more basic character choices and stuff like that, that's totally okay. I mean, that's just how people prefer their movies sometimes. But I feel like there's just a richness to the original ones that can't really be matched, and just wouldn't be tolerated by modern audiences, because they were informed by the history that they were surrounded by at the time of their release, and their pre-production and everything. So, yeah, I love the Apes franchise. Like, even when I really dislike a movie, I still like trying to understand why I dislike it. So, that being said, every single one of these movies has value to me, except maybe the Tim Burton one. But anyhow, that's pretty much all I gotta say. Let me know how you would rank these movies in the comments if you wish. I know it's an upheaval, there's a lot of them now. There's also one or two TV shows, I think. There was one animated show. I think it was 13 episodes, didn't last very long. Haven't seen that. If it's ever free one day, then maybe I'll check that out, but I can't imagine it would be anywhere to the level of the original movies, or even the remakes. But that being said, I love the Apes franchise, and I'm so curious to see where it's going to go. I'm curious to see where it'll wind up, if it'll go back to, humanoid apes eventually. Then maybe one day in the far-off future, we will see one of these remake movies where a ship crash lands and a man named Taylor walks out of them and then sees these new upright standing apes who better be in practical makeup again. I'm hoping that, as great and as beautiful as motion capture is, I'm hoping that when they do go full circle, if they choose to do so, that they go back to the practical makeup, because I love the crap out of actual movie magic like that. So, anyhow, that's all for this podcast. We're pretty much over an hour long. Hope you enjoyed, and if you did, then please, as per usual, be sure to like, comment, subscribe, ring the bell if you wish, and yeah, say whatever you want in the comments about these films. I think they're a blast. So, anyhow, that's it. Rock on, and I will see you all later.